People killed for nothing. You know, this was not something the United States needed to put in, and they thought, what a great, massive mistake. It's just a product of militarists, people who are always wanting to wave bloody sticks around and poke their nose where they don't belong. So pacifism, or something very close to pacifism, was the prevailing mood of the country in the 20s and 30s. If you go back and read the great writers of the day, you'll see them writing very telling stories, novels, about the war, and people who survived the war, who were wounded in the war. That was the way people thought about war. So they didn't want a big military. So if you have a big military, you're just going to make the generals greedy to get in a war, and you're just going to make all these war suppliers greedy to get in there and make a ton of money. Profiteering, as it's called, selling the war product. So we had this tiny military in 1940, but it gets built up. By the middle of 1945, there were more than 12 million people in the military. 12 million. Look, the pre-war labor force in this country is only a little over 50 million people. That's over a quarter of the entire pre-war labor force has been channeled into the actual military, uniformed military, and almost as many people have been channeled by these good job offers into war industries. So we've got, at the peak of the war here, defense employment that's running about 4/10 of the entire labor force. 4/10 of the labor force. If you had that now, that would be 60 million people today. 60 million people in the military or the war industry. Can you imagine that? The actual figure today is more like 3 or 4 million instead of 60. This was a kind of shift, reallocation of labor, that would have been very difficult for people to believe beforehand. It's not possible. Can't be done. Can't even support people. I mean, if they're not producing consumer goods, somebody's got to produce whatever it takes to feed, clothe, equip, transport all these people. So, how are you going to do that? Well, it was possible. It was done, but it wasn't done in the way that the historians and the economists think it was done. They think what happened was that we had an orgy of guns and butter. That's the metaphors for military and civilian outputs the economy can produce. And you may have seen this guns and butter lingo in day one or week one of an economics course. I hope you did. It's a standard way of teaching about opportunity cost, teaching about how if you use resources for one purpose, then they're not available to be used for alternative purposes. And the value you sacrifice when you use them in one way instead of another is the opportunity cost. You bear. When you produce more guns, you bear a loss, a sacrifice of the most valuable butter that could have been produced if those resources hadn't been shifted. But during World War II, these primitive Keynesians who just really got rolling in Keynesianism in the late 30s, early 40s, they looked at this through a Keynesian lens. And they said, what we're seeing here is not the economy varying an opportunity cost, it's a multiplier effect. Finally, the government has done what we wanted it to do back in the 30s. It's spent on a massive scale. If only it had done this back in 1931 and onward, we never would have had a Great Depression. Government spending would have saved the day. And that's what Professor Krugman will tell you today. If in 2008, the government hadn't simply ramped up its spending amazingly overnight, but it doubled down and doubled down again, why, there would never have been a 10% unemployment rate that we got to in 2009. Wouldn't have happened. Krugman's theory tells it. And the theory Krugman is using is something he could find in 1949 in Paul Samuelson's first edition of a textbook called Economics. The most widely used, widely translated economics book in history. It's what I call vulgar Keynesianism. It's the Keynesianism of journalists, politicians, ordinary people who've never really studied economics, think they know something about it from reading the paper. Vulgar Keynesianism, the idea that government spending is a kind of perfect substitute for private spending. And if for whatever reason private spending falters, there's not enough private consumption and private investment spending going on, that shortfall can be filled. It can be made up by governments filling the spending gap. Because the government dollar and the private dollar, they're all just dollars, right? And in Keynesianism, you don't produce anything in particular, you produce output. This output in general. Okay? It's one thing called output, aggregate output. Probably the most misleading economic concept ever devised, because it takes people's attention away from what economics is all about. Understanding how people deal with scarcity, which requires them to choose. They can't have everything. With scarcity, they have to choose what they will have. They have to choose some particular things, not output in general, not aggregate output. They have to choose particular things, and when they choose, they bear opportunity costs. And that way that they think about the costliness of different options available to them is the very essence of economics, properly understood. Keynesianism is a way of basically throwing economics in the garbage can. I'm sorry if you ever had to submit to this nonsense. I did for years on end. I studied it at the highest levels. And it gets worse as you go up. It gets more and more mathematical, more and more removed from reality, until finally it just blends in with the angelic presences somewhere up there. And it got out of my range after a while. I didn't know enough math to follow it all the way to heaven. But Professor Krugman did. At MIT, they learn all that angelic mathematical macro. And got here at Loyola. Okay, what happened during the war? Why did unemployment disappear? Because starting in the fall of 1940, the government started drafting men into the Army. And then the draft was renewed in 1941 when the first act expired. And it's interesting too, because we often talk about politics, we talk about one vote doesn't matter. Well, that's generally true in any election with a lot of voters. But it might be true even in the United States House of Representatives. And when the draft law came up for renewal in the fall of 1941, the vote to renew it was one vote victory for renewal. If one of the members of the House voting yea had voted nay, the bill would have failed, and the draft would not have been renewed. So that was how close. That's how close it was. And that tells you that even in the fall of 1941, when the world situation has become much darker, Americans were still putting enough pressure on their representatives in Congress to let them know they didn't want anything to do with that war. They didn't want anything to do with it. Now, of course, once the Japanese were goaded into bombing Pearl Harbor, that all changed overnight. And suddenly all the Americans were gung-ho, almost all the Americans. Eventually, the government drafted more than 10 million men. Okay. Right there, we've got almost 20% of the pre-war labor force. If you've got 8 or 10% unemployment and you draft 20% of the labor force, you can kiss your unemployment goodbye, right? That's history. In fact, you've got a very strong labor market now. You know, Grandma can walk out of her kitchen and get a job in the war plant now. That's what happened. That's why unemployment fell during the war. That's why it disappeared. It had nothing to do with massive government spending directly. It had nothing to do with monetarist claims about how fast the money stock rose. It did, sure. Yeah, that's how the government was helping itself pay for all of this. But that's not why unemployment disappeared. If you draft 20% of the labor force and you've got 8 or 10% unemployment, it doesn't matter if the government spends a lot more money or the Fed runs up the money stock. You're still going to have no unemployment. That's the story. It's not a story you tell in normal macro, because in normal macro you don't talk about stuff like the draft. You talk about real labor markets, you know, where wages determine how much labor people want to supply and how much they want to demand, and so forth. That's not what was driving this situation. Force was driving this situation. The government sent these letters out to young men, compelled them to register for the draft, and the letter said, welcome. You're to report such and such a place at such and such a time. Usually about a week in the future, you have to report as ordered. And if you didn't care to report, let's say you were like Dick Cheney, you had more important priorities. Amazing, isn't it? Some of the biggest war hawks in the world have more important priorities when their opportunity comes to go to war. Anyhow, you had an alternative, and you could go to prison. That's the alternative the government gave. Report as ordered to the draft, or go to prison. We'll take care of you either way. And if you were one of those few that said, screw you, they would make you pay when you went to prison. Because even in prison, you would be tortured. That's not a turn of phrase, ladies and gentlemen. That's a reality. People were tortured in prison or being draft dodgers. Yeah. Thieves and murderers were torturing people for being draft dodgers. Chew on that one for a while. That's a sign of a sick society. This is a Catholic school. Let me put in a lick for Jesus. That's not how Jesus would do things. Okay, that sermon's over. Now back to economics. This is the situation we're on. Now, the other part of the standard story the economists tell has to do with output. If you look at, I've got a picture here that shows you. Look at this solid black line here at the top. Well, it's at the top in one part of the chart. That is a measure of GDP, okay? That's the standard macro measure, gross domestic product, proportionally the value of market prices of all goods and services the economy produces in a year's time. That's our standard measure of how well the economy is performing. What's happening with real GDP. And these numbers here I've graphed are in logarithms, so you can see rates of growth by looking at the slope of lines. And what you see here that's really amazing is that during the war, there's this huge hump in total output. And this is what people look back at and call a miracle of production. Well, there's no gainsaying that there were some miracles of production during the war, all right? You look at 300,000 airplanes produced for military use. 300,000? The contractors now would be lucky if they could produce 3 in 4 years. It takes them 25 years just to get going now. But but they get paid every year. And they don't get taxed until they complete the project, which they never do. So it's a good deal. But 300,000 airplanes in 4.5 years, roughly, that's what it took. 8,000 warships of one kind or another. Right here in River City, there was a production plant, the Higgs plant, where they made thousands of landing ships. These are things that the Army and the Marine Corps used in the Pacific mainly to bring troops on shore in these little islands all over the place where the Japanese had taken up positions and the Americans, a little help from the Australians, came along and dislodged them and killed them. They didn't surrender, so you had to kill them or they just keep fighting. So these Higgins boats, landing boats, cranked out here,